Hi, I am glad to see you on my channel. Today I'll tell interesting stories from Greek mythology. Enjoy listening and don't forget to subscribe.
Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world without the sun. And it is into this world, this slow, golden, half-formed world, that we are going to travel tonight, following the soft thread of a story that is more than 3,000 years old, a story told in marble temples and painted on clay pots, whispered by priests and sung by poets, a story about a god so beautiful, so luminous, so quietly important that even today, when you step outside on a clear morning and feel the first warmth of sunlight touch your face, you are, in some small and lovely way, feeling the presence of Apollo. Let us begin at the very beginning. Long before Apollo came into the world, his father Zeus, the king of all the Olympian gods, the ruler of thunder and sky and the great complicated machinery of divine politics, had a problem. His problem, as it so often was, involved love, or at least something that Zeus called love, though historians and mythologists have spent considerable time debating exactly what that word meant when applied to the king of the gods. Zeus had fallen deeply and genuinely in love with a titaness named Leto, a figure of extraordinary gentleness in the Greek mythological tradition. Leto was not a goddess of war or storms or earthquakes. She was something quieter, something more difficult to define. She was associated with motherhood, with modesty, with the soft and reliable comfort of a world that simply continues to exist. Ancient sources describe her as gracious, mild-mannered, and extraordinarily beautiful, though her beauty was the kind that does not announce itself loudly. She was the sort of being you might overlook in a crowded room and then find yourself thinking about for days afterward. Zeus loved her, and in the way of Zeus, this love had consequences. Leto became pregnant, and when Hera, Zeus's official wife, the queen of the gods, a figure of magnificent and terrifying dignity, discovered this, her reaction was precisely what you might expect from a deity who had spent several thousand years dealing with her husband's romantic wanderings. Hera was furious, but Hera's fury was never simple or straightforward. She did not simply rage and storm. She strategized. She was, in many ways, the most politically sophisticated of all the Olympian gods, and when she decided to punish Leto, she did so with a kind of cold, deliberate precision that is both frightening and, if we are honest, rather impressive. Hera declared that no land under the sun, no place that the light touched, no solid earth that felt the warmth of day, would be permitted to offer Leto shelter in which to give birth. This was a curse of extraordinary cruelty, because Leto's pregnancy was not an easy one. Ancient sources suggest that she wandered for a very long time, heavy with the divine children she carried, for she was pregnant not with one child, but with two, the twins who would become Apollo and Artemis. She walked across the known world and found every door closed, every shore unwelcoming, every mountain and valley and forest floor refusing to offer her a place to rest. The earth itself, in obedience to Hera's will, turned away from her. Think about that image for a moment as you settle into your pillow and let the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders. Think about a figure walking, slowly, heavily, with grace and patience, through a world that refuses to receive her. It is one of the most quietly heartbreaking images in all of Greek mythology, and it lasted, according to the ancient accounts, for a very long time. Leto crossed seas and mountains. She passed through lands that would one day have names like Thessaly and Thrace and Asia Minor, and everywhere she went, the land shook its head, gently but firmly, and sent her on her way. But eventually, and this is the part where the story begins to breathe again, she came to a small, rather unremarkable island in the middle of the Aegean Sea. This island was called Delos, and Delos was different from all the other places Leto had visited for one very specific reason. Delos, you see, was not quite a regular island. In some versions of the myth, it was a floating island, not properly anchored to the seafloor, drifting with the currents. And because of this, it occupied a peculiar legal and divine gray area. Hera's curse applied to lands that were fixed and permanent. Delos, being neither one thing nor the other, being perpetually in motion, being a little bit of earth that had never fully committed to being a part of the world, Delos was, in the most technical of senses, exempt. The ancient Greeks had a beautiful way of thinking about Delos. They described it as barren and rocky and small, not particularly beautiful, not particularly special. And then, in the same breath, they described it as the most sacred place in the entire Aegean world, the center around which all the other islands turned like the hands of a great slow clock. The contrast is deliberate and instructive. It teaches us something the Greeks understood very well, which is that the most important things do not always look important from the outside. The most sacred spaces are sometimes the most humble ones. Delos agreed to receive Leto. In the Homeric hymn to Apollo, one of the oldest and most important sources we have for the story of the god's birth, likely composed sometime in the 7th century BCE, though its precise dating remains a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion, the island speaks, and its voice is uncertain and a little afraid. Delos worries that once the great shining child is born upon its shores, he will think nothing of such a small and rocky place, and will depart to build his great temples elsewhere, leaving Delos once again to drift alone in the wide sea. The dialogue between Leto and the island Delos is one of the loveliest passages in all of ancient Greek literature, because it is a conversation about trust, about the promises we make to those who shelter us in our most vulnerable moments, about what we owe to the places that receive us when no one else will. Leto made her promise. She swore by the great unbreakable oath of the gods, the oath sworn upon the waters of the river Styx, that her son would build his first and most beloved temple on the shores of Delos, that he would honor the island always, that the name of Delos would be remembered as long as the name of Apollo was sung. And Delos, reassured, stopped its drifting and became, for the first time, anchored to the floor of the sea. The island settled. It stilled. It prepared itself to receive the light of the world. The birth itself, as described in the ancient sources, was not swift. It was, in fact, extraordinarily long and difficult, 9 days and 9 nights, according to the Homeric hymn, because Hera, still pursuing her campaign against Leto with relentless determination, had done one more thing to complicate matters. She had detained Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, preventing her from traveling to Delos to assist in the delivery. Without Eileithyia, birth was impossible, and so the other goddesses who had gathered on Delos to attend Leto, figures like Dione and Rhea and Amphitrite and many others, sat with her through 9 long days, waiting, watching, while Leto endured her labor with the patience and grace that the ancient sources always ascribed to her. On the 9th day, the attending goddesses sent Iris, the rainbow goddess, the divine messenger, to Olympus with a gift of a great golden necklace to persuade Eileithyia to come at last to Delos. The gift worked. Eileithyia descended from Olympus and made her way across the sea, and the moment her feet touched the rocky shore of Delos, the birth became possible. Leto knelt in the tradition of ancient birth posture, leaning against a particular palm tree on the island, a palm tree that would be remembered and venerated for centuries afterward. And the children came. Artemis was born first, and here the story becomes even more remarkable, because the ancient tradition holds that Artemis, who would grow up to be the goddess of the hunt and the moon, a fierce and independent figure, was born so quickly and so easily that she immediately turned to help in the birth of her twin brother. The infant Artemis became, in the very first moments of her existence, a midwife, assisting in the delivery of Apollo. It is an image that tells us something essential about the relationship between these two divine siblings, the way they are always, in some sense, supporting and defining each other. The moon and the sun, the hunter and the healer, the arrow in darkness and the arrow in light. And then Apollo was born. The ancient sources describe what happened next with the kind of language that makes you understand why people built temples, why they traveled hundreds of miles on foot to attend religious festivals, why they wrote poems and composed music and carved statues in the name of this particular god. When Apollo came into the world, the island of Delos glowed. The ancient Homeric hymn says that the island was flooded with gold, that the earth beneath it shone, that the sea around it shone, that the moment of his birth was a moment of physical, visible, undeniable illumination. The other goddesses washed the newborn in fresh water and wrapped him in white cloth and bound him in golden bands, and they cried out in joy, a cry that echoed across the Aegean and reached even up to the heights of Olympus. It is worth pausing here, in the soft way this story invites pausing, to reflect on what the ancient Greeks were expressing through this image of light. Apollo was not, in the earliest layers of Greek religion, definitively the god of the sun. That role was more properly held by Helios, the sun god who drove his chariot across the sky each day. Apollo's association with light was of a different, more complex kind. He was associated with the clarity that light brings, with understanding, with vision, with the ability to see truly. He was the god who illuminated not just the physical world, but the interior world, the world of the mind and the spirit. His light was the light that falls on a piece of writing and makes the words suddenly legible, the light that comes through a window at dawn and makes you see your room and your life with new and startling clarity. The Greeks, who were nothing if not precise in their symbolic thinking, understood this distinction perfectly well. And as we continue through Apollo's story tonight, moving slowly and without hurry, through 3,000 years of myth and worship and artistic creation, you will see this theme of illumination, this particular quality of clarity bringing light, appear again and again in every role that Apollo plays, in every story that gathers around his name. But we are still on Delos, in that first golden moment, and there is one more thing that happens at Apollo's birth that deserves to be told before we let the first chapter of this long, quiet evening come gently to its close. According to tradition, the very first thing that the newborn Apollo ate was not milk, as a human infant would drink, but ambrosia and nectar, the food and drink of the gods, fed to him by the goddess Themis. And when this divine sustenance touched the infant's lips, something changed. The golden bands that wrapped him fell away. He would not be bound. He rose impossibly, beautifully, and declared himself. According to the Homeric hymn, he announced that he would be the master of the lyre and of archery, and that he would speak to mankind the will of Zeus, the great divine purpose that underpins all of creation. This is not a modest birth announcement. This is the declaration of an entire civilizational project, the promise that there will be music, there will be truth, there will be a point of contact between the human world and the divine one, and that Apollo will be the medium through which that contact is maintained. Delos shook with the weight of the moment. The sea shimmered around it. The other gods, watching from their various positions in the divine hierarchy, were moved by something they recognized as genuinely important. And the palm tree against which Leto had leaned, that particular, real, physical palm tree on the island of Delos, would be pointed out to visitors and pilgrims for centuries after, a tangible, touchable remnant of the morning when the world first received its god of light. In the centuries that followed, Delos would become one of the most sacred and visited sites in the entire Greek world. Pilgrims came from Athens and Sparta and Corinth, and from the colonies scattered across the Mediterranean, from as far away as the shores of the Black Sea and the coasts of what is today Spain. They came to walk on the same ground where Leto had knelt, to see the palm tree, to participate in the great festival called the Delia, where athletes competed and choruses sang, and the whole community of the Greek-speaking world gathered to celebrate the birthday of their luminous god. The island was considered so sacred that for a long time no one was permitted to be born or to die on Delos. When death approached, the dying were carried to the neighboring island of Renea, so that Delos would remain forever pure, forever a place of beginnings rather than endings. That impulse, the desire to preserve a place of pure beginning, to protect it from the ordinary cycles of mortality, tells us something profound about what Apollo meant to the people who worshipped him. He was, at his core, a god of beginnings, of first light, of the moment before the day truly starts, when everything is still possible and nothing has yet been determined. He was the God you prayed to when you were standing at the threshold of something new, a journey, a decision, a creative work, a question whose answer you could not yet see. There is a particular quality of light that exists only in mountain valleys in the early morning, when the sun has not yet climbed high enough to reach the valley floor, and the air is still cool and faintly blue, and everything, the stones, the trees, the thin grass growing between the rocks, seems to be holding its breath, waiting for the warmth to arrive. If you have ever stood in such a place, you will know the feeling I am describing. It is a feeling of extraordinary suspension, as though time itself has paused for a moment to consider its options. It is a feeling of something about to begin. And it is precisely this kind of light, this kind of suspended and waiting atmosphere, that we need to carry with us as we travel now from the bright shores of Delos, where we left the newborn Apollo rising in his golden radiance, to a mountain valley on the Greek mainland, a valley that would become, in time, the most sacred and the most consulted address in the entire ancient world. We are going to Delphi. And to understand what Delphi meant, and what Apollo did there, and why the story of the great serpent Python is one of the most important stories in all of Greek mythology, we need to begin not with a battle, not with a dramatic confrontation between god and monster, but with a journey. With a young god, newly arrived in the world, making his way across a landscape that is still, in many places, wild and unformed and a little dangerous. Ancient sources give us different accounts of exactly how much time passed between Apollo's birth on Delos and his arrival at the place that would become Delphi. Some traditions suggest that he was still practically an infant. that the same extraordinary divine nature which had allowed him to rise from his swaddling bands on the day of his birth also allowed him to travel and to act with purpose almost immediately. The Greeks were not particularly troubled by such chronological inconsistencies because they understood that divine time does not work the same way as human time, and that the important thing about a myth is not whether it could have happened in the precise sequence described, but what it reveals about the nature of the divine figure at its center. And what Apollo's rapid journey from birth to his first great deed reveals is something very specific and very important about his character. He does not wait. He arrives in the world with a purpose already formed, a direction already chosen, a destiny that he moves toward with the calm, unhurried certainty of a river moving toward the sea. The ancient Greeks described Apollo's first journey with a kind of reverent attention to geography that tells us something about how deeply they believed in the physical reality of their myths. He traveled, according to various sources, through the regions of Pieria and Lectus, through Euboea and the hills of Boeotia, and eventually he came to the place that was known in the oldest layers of tradition simply as Pytho. The name Delphi came later and carries its own significance, which we will arrive at in due course. Pytho was a place in the mountainous region of Phocis, on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, one of the most dramatically beautiful mountains in all of Greece. The mountain rises to nearly 8,000 feet above sea level, and the sanctuary of Delphi was built at an elevation of around 2,000 feet on its southern slope, in a fold of the mountain where two great limestone cliffs called the Phaedriades, the shining ones, catch the afternoon light and hold it in a way that makes the entire valley glow with a warm, almost amber luminescence. Even today, when you visit the ruins of Delphi, and I encourage you, in whatever quiet corner of your imagination you use for such travels, to visit it now, as you lie here in the growing stillness of the night. Even today, the place feels charged with something, some quality of attention and significance that the landscape itself seems to generate. But when Apollo arrived at Pytho, it was not the peaceful, gleaming sanctuary that later centuries would know. It was something raw, something wilder, something that had not yet been claimed or organized or made sacred in the deliberate way that humans and gods together would later make it sacred. And it was inhabited, not by priests or pilgrims or the gentle devotees of some earlier cult, though there were in fact older religious traditions at the site of Delphi that predated Apollo's arrival, a fact that the Greeks themselves acknowledged and that modern archaeology has substantially confirmed. No, what primarily inhabited the valley of Pytho, what dominated it and defined it, and made it a place of dread rather than of pilgrimage, was a creature of extraordinary and terrible power. This creature was Python. And Python requires our careful attention, because to understand why Apollo had to kill it, and why that killing was one of the most consequential acts in the entire history of Greek religion, we need to understand what Python actually was, and what it represented, and why its presence at this particular location mattered so much. Python, in the Greek mythological tradition, was a great serpent, sometimes described as a dragon, sometimes simply as a vast snake of supernatural proportions. Python was one of those primordial creatures that seemed to belong to an earlier order of the world, a time before the Olympian gods had fully established their authority, when the earth was still largely governed by chthonic powers, forces that came from beneath the ground rather than from above it. The word chthonic comes from the Greek word for earth, and chthonic religion was very different in character from the bright, sky-oriented worship of the Olympian gods. It was darker, older, more concerned with the dead and with the deep processes of the earth. with fertility and decay, with the underworld and its rulers, with the slow and patient cycles of nature that have nothing to do with human wishes or divine personalities. Python was very much a chthonic creature. It lived in the earth, it drew its power from the earth, and its presence at the location of Delphi was connected to the fact that the site sat above a natural feature, a fissure or vent in the rock from which mysterious vapors or gases were said to rise from deep underground. The ancients understood these vapors as the breath of the earth itself, as a direct exhalation from the deep body of Gaia, the earth goddess, and it was these vapors that were believed to have prophetic power, that could, under the right conditions and in the right person, induce a state of divine inspiration in which the future became, briefly and partially, visible. Python guarded this fissure. Python sat upon this prophetic vapors the way a great brooding bird sits upon an egg, protective, possessive, deeply unwilling to be disturbed. And because of this guardianship, the site of Pytho was not a place of organized prophecy in the period before Apollo's arrival. The power was there, certainly. The vapors rose, the earth breathed, the potential for prophetic revelation existed in the very ground, but it was wild power, unmediated, inaccessible, locked beneath the coils of a creature that did not share it with anyone. Now there is another dimension to the Python story that the ancient sources are careful to preserve, and that adds considerable moral and emotional complexity to what might otherwise seem like a straightforward monster-slaying narrative. In some versions of the myth, Python was connected to Hera, the same Hera who had persecuted Leto during her pregnancy, who had prevented Eileithyia from attending the birth on Delos, who had done everything in her considerable power to prevent Apollo from coming into existence. According to certain traditions, it was Hera herself who had sent Python to pursue the pregnant Leto, to make her wandering even more frightening and difficult, to add the terror of a monster to the already crushing burden of the divine queen's curse. If this tradition is true, and in mythology, the question of what is true is always more interesting than a simple yes or no, then Apollo's eventual confrontation with Python was not merely an act of territorial acquisition, not simply a god claiming a piece of real estate for his own purposes. It was something more personal. It was the son settling an account that had been opened before his birth, addressing a wrong done to his mother in the most direct and unambiguous way available to a god of his particular gifts. Apollo approached Pytho carrying his silver bow, a weapon that deserves a moment of description, because in the Greek imagination, Apollo's bow was not merely a hunting tool or a military weapon. It was an instrument of precision, of clarity, of the ability to send intention across distance and have it arrive exactly where it was aimed. To shoot with Apollo's bow was to act with perfect, undistorted purpose. There was no wavering, no second guessing, no trajectory that curved away from its target under the influence of wind or doubt. The arrow went where it was sent, and where it arrived, things changed irrevocably. This is, if you think about it, a beautiful metaphor for the kind of god Apollo was. A god of clarity, of purpose, of truth that travels in a straight line from its source to its destination, and does not apologize for what it finds when it gets there. The battle between Apollo and Python, as described in the ancient sources, most notably in the Homeric hymn to Apollo, but also in later retellings by Pindar and Ovid and many others, was not a long or uncertain struggle. Apollo did not wrestle with the serpent or try to reason with it or attempt any kind of negotiation. He shot it. He stood at a distance and he drew his silver bow and he sent his arrows into the great coiling body of the creature, again and again, until it lay dying on the rocky ground of the valley. The Homeric hymn describes the moment with a kind of grim and almost businesslike efficiency that is itself revealing. There is no triumphalism, no extended celebration of the god's victory. Python dies, and as it dies, it falls heavily to the earth, and the earth that had been its domain for so long absorbs it back, and the great body begins to rot in the heat of the sun. And it is from this rotting, the Greek word pytho means to rot, to decay, that the place gets its oldest name, Pytho, the place of rotting. The place where the old order decomposed in the sunlight so that something new could grow in its place. This is important. This detail about the name, about the rotting, is not a grim or unpleasant footnote to an otherwise glorious story. It is, in fact, one of the most theologically significant details in the entire myth, because it speaks to something the Greeks understood about the relationship between old powers and new ones, between chthonic darkness and Olympian light. Apollo did not simply destroy Python. He did not erase it or make it disappear. He allowed it to decompose where it had fallen, to return its substance to the earth from which it had come. The old power was not negated. It was transformed. The prophetic vapors still rose from the earth. The sacred fissure still breathed. But now, above that fissure, there would be a temple. And in that temple, there would be a priestess. And through that priestess, the wild, dark, chthonic power of the earth's breath would be organized, interpreted, and made accessible to the human world. The Python's power would continue, but it would continue through Apollo, filtered through his clarity and his commitment to truth, shaped by his particular gifts into something that humans could actually use. The priestess who would channel this power was called the Pythia, her title explicitly commemorating the serpent that Apollo had killed, another sign that the Greeks understood this not as an erasure, but as a transformation. The Pythia sat upon a tripod directly above the sacred fissure, and when the vapors rose around her, she entered a state of divine inspiration, what the Greeks called enthusiasm, a word that literally means being filled with a god, entheos. And in this state, she spoke. Her words were often strange and fragmented, pouring out in what some ancient sources describe as an almost incoherent stream. And it was the job of the male priests who served at the temple to organize these utterances into comprehensible form, often composing them into verse, into the oracular responses that were then delivered to the inquirers who had traveled, sometimes enormous distances, to ask their questions at Delphi. The oracle at Delphi became, over the centuries, genuinely one of the most important political and spiritual institutions in the entire ancient world. This is not mythology speaking. This is history, confirmed by archaeology, by inscriptions, by the testimony of dozens of ancient writers, including Herodotus, Thucydides, Plutarch, and many others. Cities consulted the oracle before founding colonies. Kings consulted it before going to war. Individuals consulted it about marriages, about journeys, about the great decisions that seemed too large and too consequential to make without some form of divine guidance. The oracle was consulted, according to ancient sources, by figures as various as the Lydian king Croesus, whose famous consultation produced one of the most celebrated of all oracular responses, and by the Athenian city-state before the decisive naval battle of Salamis in 480 BCE, and by Alexander the Great before his campaigns of conquest, and by innumerable ordinary individuals whose names we will never know, who came with their small private questions and received their small private answers, and went home changed. The sanctuary itself grew over the centuries into something of extraordinary physical grandeur. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi, in its final classical form, was a massive Doric structure built of local limestone and Parian marble. Its pediments decorated with sculptural programs of great sophistication, its interior walls inscribed with the famous maxims that represented the distilled wisdom of Greek civilization, most famously Gnoti Seauton, Know Thyself, and Medin Egen, Nothing in Excess. These inscriptions were not merely decorative. They were understood as the actual words of Apollo, transmitted through his oracle and then carved into stone so that every visitor to the sanctuary would encounter them, would be reminded of the fundamental Apollonian values before they proceeded to ask their questions and receive their answers. Know thyself, nothing in excess. These two phrases, taken together, constitute something very close to a complete philosophy of life. And the fact that they were placed at the entrance to Apollo's most sacred space tells us everything we need to know about what this god was fundamentally about. The sanctuary complex at Delphi was not only the temple and the oracle, it was an entire sacred precinct, a temenos, that included a theater, a stadium where the Pythian Games were held every 4 years, numerous treasuries built by the various Greek city-states to house their offerings to Apollo, a gymnasium, a sacred spring called the Castalia, and literally hundreds of statues and votive monuments accumulated over centuries of worship. The Pythian Games were the second most important athletic festival in the ancient Greek world after the Olympics, and unlike the Olympics, where the prizes were simply olive wreaths, the Pythian Games awarded laurel wreaths, the laurel being Apollo's sacred plant, connected to a story of love and transformation that we will tell in a later chapter of this long evening. Walking through the sanctuary of Delphi in antiquity must have been an experience of almost overwhelming sensory richness. The sacred way that wound up through the precinct from the main entrance to the temple was lined on both sides with monuments and offerings, bronze statues, marble dedications, small buildings housing the treasures of Corinth and Athens and Sipnos and Massalia and Cyrene and dozens of other cities and communities, each one trying to outdo the others in the magnificence of their offerings to the god. The whole ensemble shimmered and gleamed in the mountain light, catching the sun from 100 different angles, and above it all, the Phaedriades, the shining cliffs, rose into the clear Greek sky, reflecting light back down into the valley with that characteristic warm amber glow that gives the whole site its peculiar, charged, luminous quality. There is one more element of the Python story that deserves to be told before we let this chapter come to rest. And it is an element that reveals something of Apollo's character that might surprise you, given what we have just heard about the swift, decisive, almost merciless efficiency with which he killed the serpent. After Python was dead, and as the victory celebration at Delphi was beginning to take shape, a complication arose. Apollo had killed Python in what he considered a just and necessary act. But the killing of a sacred creature, even a monstrous one, was not without spiritual consequences in the Greek moral framework. Python, whatever else it was, had been a living being of divine significance, and its death created a pollution, a miasma in the Greek term, that attached itself to the killer and required ritual purification before normal life and worship could be resumed. Apollo, god of purity and light, was himself subject to this law. He could not simply declare himself exempt from the moral consequences of killing because he was divine. And so he went into a period of exile and purification, traveling to the Vale of Tempe in Thessaly, where he spent a period performing the necessary rituals to cleanse himself of the pollution of the killing. When he returned to Delphi, purified and ready to establish his sanctuary in proper and legitimate form, he brought with him the memory of this exile, this humbling, this acknowledgement that even gods are answerable to moral law. The Pythian Games, celebrated at Delphi every 4 years, were in part a commemoration of this story, a ritual reenactment of Apollo's killing of Python, his exile, his purification, and his triumphant return. A young man selected for the purpose would run from the sanctuary, symbolically representing the god's exile, and then return to a great civic welcome, representing his purified return. The performance, repeated every 4 years for centuries, kept the story alive in a way that was not merely theatrical, but genuinely theological. A reminder that purification after violence is not weakness, but wisdom, that the willingness to acknowledge moral consequence is not a diminishment of power, but an expression of the highest kind of integrity. This, perhaps, is the deepest thing the story of Apollo and Python has to tell us as we lie here in the growing quiet of the night. That light does not simply banish darkness by ignoring it. That clarity is not achieved by pretending that difficult things did not happen. That the God of truth, of real, mature, honest truth, is also the God who acknowledges the cost of his own actions, who goes into the difficult valley of self-examination and purification before claiming the high sacred ground of the oracle. Apollo kills the serpent, and then he humbles himself before the law that applies to everyone, including gods. And only then, clean, acknowledged, truthful, does he take his seat at the center of the ancient world and begin the long work of answering questions. The sacred valley of Delphi settles into its evening quiet now, the Phaedriades catching the last of the light, the temple casting its long shadow across the precinct. The Castalia spring murmurs softly somewhere below, its water cold and clear as it has always been, running down from the mountain through the centuries unchanged. The laurel trees that grow around the sanctuary stir in a gentle evening breeze, and if you listen very carefully, in that particular quality of attentive stillness that comes when the body is relaxed and the mind is just beginning to release its hold on the day, you might hear, or imagine you hear, something that could be music, very faint, very far away, carried on the wind from somewhere higher up the mountain, something with strings, something patient and clear and absolutely certain of its own direction. The baby in question was Hermes, the god of travelers, of thieves, of merchants, of language and communication, and the nimble passage between different states of being. Hermes was the divine messenger, the one who moved between the world of the living and the world of the dead with equal ease, carrying communications in both directions without apparent effort or discomfort. He was the cleverest of all the Olympian gods, not with Apollo's clarity, not with Athena's strategic wisdom, but with a different, quicker, more improvisational intelligence, the kind that notices an opportunity and acts on it before the slower-moving minds around it have even registered that an opportunity exists. Hermes was the god of the sideways glance, the unexpected solution, the brilliant shortcut. And on the very day of his birth, which is either a sign of his extraordinary gifts or an indication of the kind of god he was going to be, or very probably both, he performed an act that would have enormous consequences for Apollo, for music, and for the entire subsequent history of human artistic expression. The morning of his birth, Hermes climbed out of his cradle. This alone should tell you something. He climbed out of his cradle and he went wandering. A newborn infant, divine, and therefore capable of things that would be impossible for a human baby, but still a newborn, with a newborn's official obligations of sleeping and eating entirely disregarded in favor of exploration. He wandered to the entrance of his cave on Mount Selene in Arcadia, and there, on the threshold, he found a tortoise. The tortoise was going about its tortoise business, slow, deliberate, carrying its house upon its back in the manner that tortoises have carried their houses since long before the Greeks were naming gods. Hermes looked at the tortoise for a moment with those quick, dark eyes of his, and he saw something that no one before him had ever seen. He saw a musical instrument. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. He actually saw in the curved shell of the tortoise and the potential of stretched strings across it the physical form of something that did not yet exist but was about to. He saw the lyre, the Homeric hymn to Hermes, which is the primary ancient source for this story and one of the most delightful texts in all of Greek literature, describes what happens next with a kind of affectionate and slightly incredulous humor that suggests even the ancient poet telling the story found Hermes' behavior a little difficult to believe. Hermes picks up the tortoise. He speaks to it, actually speaks to it, addressing the creature with a short speech about its good fortune in encountering him on this particular morning. Then, with the efficient and completely unapologetic practicality that characterizes everything Hermes does, he kills it, hollows out the shell, stretches ox gut strings across it, and plays the resulting instrument. And the sound that comes from this improvised, unprecedented, entirely new thing is extraordinary, beautiful, perfect from the first note, as though the instrument had always existed and was simply waiting for someone to build it. Hermes plays, and the sound fills the cave on Mount Selene, and the mountain holds it for a moment before releasing it into the wider air of the morning. But Hermes, as we have established, was not a god who rested on his achievements. Having invented the lyre in the morning, he was ready for a new project by the afternoon. And the project he chose was one of staggering ambition for a deity who had been alive for approximately 1 day. He decided to steal the cattle of Apollo. Apollo, at this point in the mythology, maintained a sacred herd of cattle, large, magnificent animals of divine quality, grazing in the meadows of Pieria in northern Greece. These were not ordinary cattle. They were the kind of cattle that a god kept, which meant they were symbolic as well as literal, representative of Apollo's wealth and status and divine abundance. Hermes wanted them, whether he wanted them for any specific practical purpose or simply because they were Apollo's and taking them was an irresistible demonstration of his own capabilities. The ancient sources are a little ambiguous. Perhaps Hermes himself was not entirely sure. This is characteristic of him, acting first and understanding his own motivations later, moving at the speed of inspiration rather than the speed of deliberation. What follows in the hymn to Hermes is an extended comic masterpiece of divine mischief. Hermes drives Apollo's cattle away from their meadow in Pieria, but he drives them backwards, making them walk in reverse so that their hoof prints point in the wrong direction, back toward where they came from, rather than toward where they are going. He also fashions extraordinary sandals for himself from woven grass and branches, sandals that leave no recognizable tracks of their own. Then he drives 50 cattle of Apollo across the length of Greece, stopping at one point to slaughter 2 of them for a feast, during which he invents the practice of dividing meat into 12 portions, 1 for each Olympian deity, which some ancient sources read as a sly act of political positioning, as though the 1-day-old Hermes was already thinking about his eventual place at the divine table. After eating, he hides the remaining cattle in a cave, covers his tracks as best he can, and returns to his cradle on Mount Cillin. He wraps himself in his infant's swaddling bands. He assumes the expression of a sleeping baby who has been in his cradle all morning and most of the afternoon, and who knows absolutely nothing about any cattle. Apollo noticed immediately that his cattle were gone. This is, of course, exactly what you would expect. Apollo, the god of clarity and truth, the god whose light illuminates all things, was not someone whose possessions could be stolen without detection. He noticed and he searched, and the search was not easy because of Hermes' careful misdirection with the reversed hoofprints and the unreadable sandals. But Apollo was persistent, and he was perceptive, and eventually the trail led him to Mount Cillin, and to the cave, and to the infant Hermes lying in his cradle with his eyes closed and his small fists curled in the attitude of complete and utter innocence. The confrontation between Apollo and the infant Hermes is one of the most purely entertaining scenes in all of ancient mythology, and what makes it particularly wonderful is the way it reveals both gods so completely and so specifically. Apollo is outraged, genuinely, hotly, entirely justified in his outrage, and he states his case with clarity and force. He knows Hermes took the cattle. He knows the infant in the cradle is not actually sleeping. He demands the return of his property immediately, and his demands are articulate and reasonable and entirely unanswered by anything that could be called a cooperative response. Hermes from his cradle denies everything. He denies having taken the cattle. He denies knowing what cattle are. He points out with apparent sincerity that he is a newborn baby who was in his cradle all day and is therefore clearly incapable of having stolen anything. He appeals to Zeus as a witness of his innocence. He wraps himself more tightly in his swaddling bands. He is the picture of injured infant dignity. Apollo is not fooled. He drags Hermes, cradle and all in some versions of the story, before Zeus on Mount Olympus to have the matter adjudicated by the king of the gods. And here something shifts in the story, because Zeus, watching this confrontation between his two sons, finds the whole situation rather amusing. He can see perfectly well that Hermes stole the cattle. Apollo's version of events is obviously correct. But he also cannot entirely suppress his delight at his new son's extraordinary audacity and inventiveness. He instructs Hermes to return the cattle. Hermes, seeing that the game is over, accepts this instruction with good grace, and then, as they walk together toward the cave where the cattle are hidden, something happens that changes everything. Hermes picks up his lyre. He begins to play. What the ancient sources describe at this moment is not simply music, but something more overwhelming than music. Something that arrives in Apollo with the force of genuine revelation. Apollo hears the lyre for the first time, and the sound stops him where he stands. The god of music, the god of the silver bow and the silver voice, the god who was associated with musical arts from the moment of his birth on Delos. This god, standing on a Greek hillside in the afternoon light, hears an instrument that had not existed that morning and is immediately, completely, irreversibly undone by it. The Homeric hymn describes him as struck with longing and wonder. He stands and listens, and the music moves through him the way the morning light moves through clear water, touching everything it passes and changing the quality of each thing it touches. He has never heard anything like it. He will never be the same. He forgets about the cattle. He forgets about his outrage and his legitimate grievances and the indignity of having been robbed by a baby. He listens. And when the music stops, he does something that is, for Apollo, remarkably direct and emotionally transparent. He offers to trade. He will accept the lyre, this new, extraordinary, impossible instrument in exchange for the cattle, all 50 of the remaining cattle, plus in various versions of the story, his golden staff, the symbol of his divine authority as a shepherd of sacred herds. He is willing to give all of this for the lyre, and the almost unseemly eagerness with which he makes this offer tells us something very important about Apollo that we might not have expected from the precise, purposeful, light-bearing God we met in the first 2 chapters. He is capable of being moved. He is capable of wanting something so much that his usual composure temporarily abandons him. He hears beauty, and he reaches for it with both hands, titles and dignities, and justified grievances all momentarily set aside. Hermes, who is nothing if not a good trader, accepts these terms immediately. He hands over the lyre, he receives the cattle and the golden staff, and in this exchange, in this moment of divine commerce on a Greek hillside in the golden afternoon, something of extraordinary importance for human history is accomplished, because the lyre passes from the god of improvisation and spontaneity into the hands of the god of order and clarity and artistic purpose. The instrument that Hermes invented in a single morning's flash of inspiration becomes, in Apollo's hands, something different, something more developed, more deliberate, more deeply explored. Hermes gave the lyre its existence. Apollo gave it its meaning. The relationship between Apollo and Hermes after this exchange is one of the warmest and most genuinely affectionate, divine friendships in the entire Greek pantheon. The 2 gods become allies and companions, their very different qualities complementing each other in ways that neither could achieve alone. Apollo's orderly, purposeful clarity is enriched by his proximity to Hermes's quick wit and spontaneous creativity. Hermes's improvisational brilliance is given direction and depth by his association with Apollo's commitment to craft and excellence. Together, they represent something close to a complete theory of artistic creation, the inspired moment of invention and the long-disciplined work of refinement, both necessary, neither sufficient without the other. Apollo with his lyre became, in the Greek imagination, the very source and center of all music. He was the leader of the Muses, those 9 divine sisters who presided over every form of human creative expression, from epic poetry and lyric verse to history, astronomy, dance, comedy, and tragedy. The Muses were not independent of Apollo, but gathered around him, inspired by him, directed by him, the way that the light from a single source disperses into 9 distinct rays, each illuminating a different dimension of the human creative experience. Mount Parnassus, the same mountain above whose slopes Delphi was built, was home to both Apollo and the Muses, and the spring of Hippocrene on nearby Mount Helicon, sacred to the Muses, was understood to flow ultimately from the same divine source as the prophetic spring at Delphi. Prophecy and poetry, it turns out, come from the same place. They are 2 expressions of the same fundamental capacity, the ability to perceive what is true and to render it in a form that other humans can receive. The music of Apollo's lyre was described in ancient sources with a consistent vocabulary of specific qualities, qualities that tell us a great deal about what the Greeks valued in music and more broadly in art. It was clear, it was ordered, it was beautiful with a beauty that was not accidental or purely emotional, but was connected to underlying mathematical proportions and relationships. The Greeks understood, and this is one of their most extraordinary intellectual achievements, that music and mathematics were not separate disciplines, but aspects of the same deep reality. The intervals between musical notes corresponded to precise numerical ratios. The harmony that made music beautiful was the same harmony that governed the movements of the planets and the ratios of the cosmos. When Apollo played, he was not merely making pleasant sounds. He was sounding out the underlying structure of the universe, making audible for a moment the organizing principles that normally operate in silence, too large and too fundamental to be perceived directly. This idea that music is a form of cosmological revelation, that the beauty we hear in organized sound is a reflection of the mathematical beauty that organizes reality itself, was one of the most fertile ideas in the entire history of Western thought. The Pythagoreans took it and built a philosophy from it. Plato took it and built a theory of education from it, arguing that music was the most important subject to teach young people because exposure to beautiful, orderly music literally shaped the character of the soul toward beauty and order. Medieval scholars took it and organized the entire curriculum of the liberal arts around it, placing music at the center of the quadrivium alongside arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. Johann Sebastian Bach took it and wrote music of such mathematical intricacy and emotional power that it continues to reduce people to tears more than 3 centuries after his death. And behind all of it, in the most distant and foundational place, stands Apollo with his lyre, playing the ratio of the universe to anyone willing to listen carefully enough. There is a famous story, not from the oldest mythological sources, but from later Greek and Roman tradition, about what happened when Apollo played for the world at large. It is the story that his music could move not only human hearts, but the physical world itself. Stones shifted, trees leaned toward the sound. Animals that had been fighting lay down together in the music's presence and forgot their enmity. Rivers slowed their current to listen. This tradition of music that physically moves the natural world was one that the Greeks applied to several figures, most famously to Orpheus, the great mortal musician whose story we will touch upon later in our evening. But it begins always with Apollo. It begins with the idea that truly divine music is not a decoration on the surface of the world, but a force that operates on the world's deepest levels, touching the organizing principles of matter and life and motion and making them for a moment responsive to human feeling. The lyre that Apollo played was golden. This matters in the Greek symbolic vocabulary because gold was the metal of divinity and of perfection, incorruptible, untarnishing, catching light without absorbing it, giving it back to the world unchanged. A golden lyre does not age. It does not rust or warp or go out of tune with the weather. It plays the same notes in the same perfect ratios forever, because the material from which it is made is immune to time. This is Apollo's music, eternal, precise, as true today as it was at the moment of its first sounding. This is why the ancient Greeks felt that when they heard genuinely beautiful music, music that seemed to reach past the personal and the ephemeral and touch something larger and more permanent, they were not merely having an aesthetic experience. They were briefly in contact with something divine, something that was, in its essential nature, outside of time. But we should not let Apollo's music become too abstract, too cosmological, too far from the warm and human story we have been telling. Because there is another side to it, a side that is entirely personal, entirely emotional, sometimes heartbreaking in its intensity. Apollo the musician was also Apollo the lover, and the connections between music and love in his mythology are deep and complex and sometimes very painful. He was a god who felt things acutely, who expressed those feelings through his music with a directness and vulnerability that might surprise us given his reputation for clarity and control. When Apollo loved and lost, and he loved and lost many times, as we will explore in the chapters ahead, it was his lyre he turned to, his music through which the grief and longing and pierce, and he loved and lost many times, as we will explore in the chapters ahead. It was his lyre he turned to, his music through which the grief and longing and piercing tenderness of those experiences found their form. His music was not only the sound of cosmic order, it was also the sound of a heart that knew how to break and how to keep playing anyway. There is one more story that belongs to this chapter, a story about what happens when the music of Apollo meets a very different musical tradition, a story that the ancient Greeks told with a moral seriousness that might initially surprise us given how strange and even violent it is. It is the story of Marsyas the satyr, and it is a story about the limits of pride and the difference between inspired spontaneity and true mastery. Marsyas was a satyr, one of those half-human, half-animal figures of Greek mythology who inhabited the wilder, less civilized margins of the world, associated with nature in its unrefined state, with wine and physical pleasure, and the kind of music that is made for dancing rather than for contemplation. Marsyas was a musician of genuine and extraordinary ability. He played the aulos, the double flute, an instrument with a very different quality from the lyre, more urgent, more piercing, more emotionally raw, an instrument that bypassed the rational mind entirely and went straight for the body, making it want to move. The aulos was associated with Dionysus, the god of wine and transformation, rather than with Apollo, and this association tells us immediately that we are dealing with a different aesthetic philosophy, music as ecstasy and release, rather than music as order and revelation. Marsyas became so skilled on the aulos that he made the catastrophic error of challenging Apollo to a musical contest. The terms were simple and terrible. Whoever won could do whatever they wished with the loser. Apollo accepted the challenge without hesitation, and the two musicians played before a panel of muses as judges. The contest, by all ancient accounts, was extremely close. Marsyas was genuinely extraordinary, and the aulos in his hands achieved things that seemed almost impossible for a reed instrument. But Apollo, as the contest continued, introduced something that tipped the balance irrevocably in his favor. He turned his lyre upside down and played it upside down, producing the same beautiful, perfect music as before. Then he challenged Marsyas to do the same with his aulos. To play an aulos upside down is, of course, physically impossible. The instrument requires the breath to enter it from one specific end, and inverting it produces only silence. Marsyas could not meet the challenge. Apollo won. The punishment that Apollo inflicted on Marsyas was severe to a degree that ancient and modern readers alike have found troubling. He flayed the satyr alive, removed his skin, and hung it at the entrance to a cave near the town of Selene in Phrygia. This punishment, brutal as it is, was understood by the Greeks in the context of hubris, the particular form of pride that consists of challenging the divine order, of claiming an equality with the gods that belongs to no mortal or semi-divine creature, however talented. Marsyas was not punished merely for being good at music. He was punished for claiming that his music was equal to or greater than Apollo's, for suggesting that the wild, body-centered, ecstatic music of the aulos was equivalent in value and dignity to the ordered cosmic truth-bearing music of the lyre. In the Greek moral universe, this was not simply an aesthetic disagreement. It was a claim about the nature of reality, about what matters most in the organization of the world, and it was a claim that Apollo, as the divine representative of order, clarity, and measured truth, could not allow to stand unchallenged. And yet, and this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting rather than simply violent, the ancient sources record that even Apollo was disturbed by what he had done to Marsyas. Some traditions say that he regretted it immediately, that the sight of the satyr's suffering moved him to remorse. Others say that when the nymphs and satyrs of the surrounding countryside wept for Marsyas so copiously that their tears formed a river, Apollo felt the weight of their grief and honored it. The river that formed from those tears was named after Marsyas. It still bears that name today, the Tyne River in modern Turkey. Apollo's punishment was real and irreversible, but so was the acknowledgement of loss. So was the river of tears. The story in its fullness does not simply celebrate Apollo's victory. It holds both things at once, the necessity of his judgment and the genuine cost of its execution, in the way that only the greatest mythological stories can hold complexity without resolving it. The night is settling more deeply now around you. The day's sounds have mostly fallen away, replaced by that particular texture of nocturnal quiet that is not really silence, but a different and more spacious kind of sound. The sound of the world breathing, of things resting, of the smaller nocturnal creatures going about their patient, unhurried business in the dark. And somewhere in that quiet, if you listen in the manner that we have been practicing through these 3 chapters, attentively but without strain, openly but without urgency, there is something that could be music. Perhaps it is music you actually hear, the distant sound of a neighbor's late-night listening, or the wind in branches outside your window organized for a moment by the particular shape of the night air into something almost melodic. Or perhaps it is music you remember, something played long ago in a room that no longer exists, by hands that have since fallen still, music that is nevertheless perfectly preserved in whatever part of you preserves such things, ready to play whenever you find yourself in a sufficient quality of quiet. Either way, it is Apollo's. All music is Apollo's, in the end. From the lyre that Hermes made from a tortoise shell on Mount Selene in the earliest morning of the world, through 3,000 years of strings and pipes and voices, and every instrument the human imagination has constructed in the long project of organizing air into meaning. All of it traces back to that first exchange on a Greek hillside, to the moment when the god of light heard the god of inspiration play and reached for the instrument with both hands, knowing that he had found the thing that would allow him to do what he most needed to do. Not just to illuminate the world from outside it, like a lamp illuminating a room, but to enter into the world, into the human experience, into the full complexity of joy and grief and longing and wonder, and to transform it, note by note, into something that could be shared, something that could reach past the individual heart into a space where all hearts, for a moment, beat together. The golden lyre rests now. The last note has dissolved into the surrounding quiet. In the next chapter, we will follow Apollo into the territory of his many loves. Stories more personal, more tender, sometimes more sorrowful than anything we have encountered so far. But that journey belongs to the next gentle hour of darkness. For now, the music is enough. For now, the music is everything. Let it carry you the rest of the way into sleep, into that wordless, imageless depth where Apollo's oldest gift, not light, not prophecy, not healing, but simply the organized silence between one note and the next does its oldest and most necessary work. Daphne was a nymph, one of those semi-divine daughters of rivers and mountains and springs who populate the Greek mythological world with such generous abundance, filling every landscape with a kind of living divinity that makes the natural world itself feel animate and aware. Daphne was the daughter of Peneus, the river god of Thessaly, and she was extraordinary even among nymphs, not only for her beauty, which was considerable and luminous, and of the particular quality that makes ordinary light seem somehow insufficient, but for her fierce and passionate commitment to a life of independence. She was a huntress, a devotee of Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, the virgin goddess of the hunt and the moon, and she had asked her father for a gift that he, with some reluctance but genuine love, had granted her: the gift of eternal chastity, of freedom from the bonds of love and marriage, of a life lived entirely on her own terms in the wild landscapes she preferred to any human or divine company. She was, in other words, precisely the kind of person who had absolutely no interest in the attentions of a god. And it was precisely this quality, this self-possession, this completeness, this refusal to be available, that made the encounter with Apollo so inevitable and so catastrophic. Here we need to introduce a third character, because the story of Apollo and Daphne does not begin with Apollo and Daphne. It begins with Eros, the god of love, often depicted as a winged boy with a quiver of arrows, some tipped with gold to inspire love, and some tipped with lead to inspire revulsion. Eros and Apollo had recently had an encounter that had not gone well for either of them, though it had gone considerably worse for Eros. Apollo, flushed with the pride of his recent victory over Python, had come across the young Eros and made the mistake that pride so reliably produces. He had mocked the boy's weapon. A bow in the hands of a child. Apollo, who had just killed the greatest serpent in the world with his silver bow, found the idea of love's small arrows wielded by this small winged figure somewhat risible, and he said so. With the eloquent confidence of someone who has recently accomplished something genuinely impressive and has not yet learned that impressive accomplishments do not make you invulnerable to the universe's sense of irony. Eros's response was immediate, precise, and utterly devastating. He drew 2 arrows from his quiver. The first, tipped with gold, the arrow of irresistible love, he shot into Apollo. The second, tipped with lead, the arrow of absolute revulsion, he shot into Daphne. And then he watched, with the satisfaction of someone who has just demonstrated a point beyond any possibility of argument, as the consequences unfolded. Apollo saw Daphne and was struck through with a longing so immediate and so overwhelming that it erased in a single instant every other thought and purpose and plan he had carried into that morning. This is the gold-tipped arrow doing exactly what it was designed to do, not producing a gentle warmth of affection that might grow over time into something considered and mutual, but a sudden, total, consuming desire that bypassed every faculty of reason and discretion that Apollo possessed. He who was clarity itself became, in this moment, completely unclear about everything except the fact of Daphne. Her dark hair flying as she ran through the forest, her bare feet certain on the rocky ground, the way the light moved on her skin between the shadows of the trees. He pursued her. Of course he pursued her. The gold arrow left him no alternative. Daphne ran. The lead arrow had done its work as thoroughly as the gold arrow had done its. She felt for Apollo not merely indifference, but something active and physical, a revulsion that expressed itself as pure kinetic energy. as the absolute need to be somewhere, anywhere, other than where he was. She ran with the speed and skill of a huntress who knew these forests intimately, who had spent her entire life in this kind of landscape, whose feet knew every root and stone. She ran beautifully, as everything about Daphne was beautiful, and Apollo ran after her, and the distance between them slowly, inevitably closed, because he was a god and she was a nymph, and the physics of the situation had only one possible conclusion. She reached the river Peneus, her father's river, the water that had been her first home, the presence that had known her longest in the world. She reached it just as Apollo's hand was about to close on her shoulder, just as the pursuit was ending in the way that pursuits of this kind always end. And she cried out to her father, to the river itself, to the water that knew her name, and she asked for the only help that remained available to her. She asked to be changed. She asked to be made into something that could not be caught, could not be possessed, could not be compelled to be what someone else's desire required her to be. The river heard her. The earth heard her. The transformation was immediate and complete. Her skin became bark. Her hair became leaves. Her reaching arms became branches. Her feet, which had run so certainly across the rocky ground, grew downward into the earth and became roots, anchoring her to the riverbank with a permanence that no pursuit could overcome. She became a laurel tree, beautiful still, extraordinarily beautiful, the leaves catching the light with a particular silver-green shimmer that seemed to carry within it the memory of the nymph who had been a huntress. She became a tree. She became the one thing in the world that Apollo could not have. Apollo stopped. He stood before the laurel tree, and whatever the gold arrow had done to him did not dissolve or diminish in the face of the transformation. If anything, it deepened into something more complex, more aching, more suffused with the particular quality of loss that comes when you understand, for the first time, that the thing you want most in the world has placed itself permanently beyond your reach. He embraced the tree. He pressed his cheek against the bark that had been her skin. He felt her heartbeat, some ancient sources say, still there, deep in the wood, the living pulse of the nymph who had become a tree but had not ceased to be herself. And he spoke to her in what is one of the most quietly devastating speeches in all of ancient mythology. He told her that if she could not be his wife, she would be his tree, that the laurel would be sacred to him forever, that he would wear her leaves in his hair and adorn his lyre with her branches, that her leaves would crown the foreheads of heroes and poets and victors in his games, that she would be honored everywhere he was honored, and that this honor would be eternal, because he was a god, and therefore his grief was eternal, and therefore his remembrance was eternal, and therefore she, Daphne, the nymph who had chosen transformation over surrender, would be remembered as long as the world remembered Apollo. And what did the laurel tree do when Apollo made these promises? The ancient sources say that its branches moved. They moved not in the wind. There was no wind, but of themselves, bending slightly toward Apollo in something that the Greeks read as acknowledgement. Not love, not consent, not the reciprocation that Apollo had wanted and would never have, but acknowledgement. The tree heard him. The tree that had been Daphne recognized his grief and moved her branches in a gesture that was not a yes, but was perhaps a kind of peace. A recognition that even in the form she had chosen, she could acknowledge what had been said without surrendering to what she had fled. The laurel became, from that day forward, Apollo's sacred plant. The laurel wreath was the crown of victory in the Pythian Games, the crown placed on the heads of triumphant generals in Roman triumphs, the crown that gave us the English word laureate, as in poet laureate, one crowned with laurel, one honored by Apollo. Every time a wreath of laurel was placed on a head in the ancient world, it carried within it the entire history of this story. The love that could not be reciprocated, the transformation that preserved dignity at the cost of form, the grief that became reverence, the loss that became honor. Every laurel wreath was also always a quiet memorial to a nymph who had chosen the shape of a tree over the weight of an unwanted love. Let us rest for a moment in the soft green shade of the laurel tree before we move to the second story. The night has deepened around you while we have been here, and the particular quality of the darkness has changed. It is fuller now, more settled, the way darkness gets as the night moves past its middle point and begins, almost imperceptibly, to consider the direction of morning. The laurel leaves move very softly above us, catching what light there is, their silver-green shimmer unchanged from the moment of Daphne's transformation to this present moment and forward into all the moments this story will continue to inhabit. Some things, once made sacred, remain sacred without effort. Some losses, once fully acknowledged, become a form of permanent beauty. The next story lives in a very different emotional register. If the story of Daphne is about desire that could never be answered, the story of Hyacinthus is about love that was fully mutual, fully reciprocated, fully real, and was lost anyway, not to refusal or to transformation, but to the blind, random, pitiless fact of accident. It is, in some ways, the hardest story. Hyacinthus was a Spartan prince, mortal, beautiful in a way that the Greeks associated specifically with youth at its most perfect flowering, the beauty that is inseparable from its own impermanence, because it is the kind of beauty that belongs only to a specific window of time and cannot survive the ordinary passage from one season to the next. He had dark hair and gray eyes, and the particular physical grace of someone who has grown up athletic and outdoors, whose body knows how to move through the world with ease and pleasure. He was, by all ancient accounts, genuinely remarkable enough to attract the attention of several divine figures simultaneously, because the Greek mythological tradition records that both Apollo and Zephyrus, the god of the west wind, loved Hyacinthus and competed for his company and affection. Hyacinthus chose Apollo. This is important. It was a genuine choice, freely made, not the result of a golden arrow or any other form of divine compulsion. He preferred Apollo, his clarity, his music, his warmth, the particular quality of the sun god's company that made everything seem more vivid and more meaningful. The two of them spent their days together in the landscapes around Sparta, hunting in the hill forests, swimming in the clear, cold rivers that ran down from the Taygetos Mountains, spending long afternoons in the comfortable, entirely natural intimacy of two people who have chosen each other and are at ease in that choice. Apollo set aside his divine dignity with Hyacinthus in a way that he set it aside for very few. He carried nets for fishing. He held the hunting dogs. He did ordinary things, companionable things, things that had no particular divine significance, but had enormous human significance, because they were the texture of a shared life, the accumulation of small, ordinary moments from which love is actually made. The ancient sources describe him as genuinely, straightforwardly happy in this period. Happy in the immediate, uncomplicated way that happiness exists when you are in the right place with the right person, doing something simple and good. and the light is falling well, and there is no particular reason for the moment to be significant, except that it is, quietly and completely, the best moment you can imagine. Zephyrus watched all of this. Zephyrus, the west wind, who had also loved Hyacinthus and had not been chosen. The gods did not handle rejection with the equanimity that we might hope for, and Zephyrus was no exception. He watched Apollo and Hyacinthus together, and the watching fed something in him that was not love, but had begun as love, and had curdled in the heat of jealousy into something darker and more dangerous. The day came when Apollo and Hyacinthus were practicing with the discus on the broad flat ground near the banks of the Eurotas River. The discus was a bronze disc of considerable weight, and throwing it well required a particular combination of strength and technique, and the willingness to commit completely to the motion, to release the body's held-back reserves of power all at once in a single rotating sweep. Apollo threw first, and the discus flew with a god's precision, straight, far, a clean arc against the blue Spartan sky. Hyacinthus watched it land and ran forward eagerly to retrieve it, to throw it back, to match the god's distance if he could. Zephyrus felt the moment arrive. He was the wind. He controlled the air through which the discus traveled. And as Hyacinthus ran toward the discus, and the discus was still in motion, Zephyrus blew. A small directed gust, precisely aimed, changing the discus's trajectory by exactly the right amount. The bronze disc struck Hyacinthus on the head with a force that left no possibility of recovery. He fell on the banks of the Eurotas, and the blood that ran from the wound was dark against the pale grass, and the warm Spartan afternoon suddenly contained something cold and permanent and entirely without remedy. Apollo reached him immediately. Of course, Apollo reached him immediately. There are no words adequate to describe the speed at which a god moves toward someone they love, who is falling. He gathered Hyacinthus in his arms. He tried everything that his divine gifts allowed. He was the god of healing, the god who would later be the patron of all medicine, the god whose son Asclepius would become the greatest healer who ever lived. He tried. The ancient sources are very clear about this. Apollo tried, and he failed because there are limits even to divine power, and one of those limits is this: that death, once fully arrived, does not yield to love or skill or divine intention. It yields to nothing. It is the one force in the universe that the Olympian gods, for all their power, could not permanently reverse. Hyacinthus died in Apollo's arms on the bank of the Eurotas, and Apollo held him, and the afternoon light continued to fall across the Spartan plain as it had always fallen, indifferent and beautiful, and completely unchanged by what had just happened within it. What Apollo did next is one of the most quietly beautiful acts in all of Greek mythology. He transformed his grief into a flower. From the blood of Hyacinthus, where it had fallen on the pale grass, he caused a flower to grow, purple, beautiful, marked with the letters A-I-A-I, which is the Greek cry of lamentation, so that the flower itself would always carry in its markings the sound of grief, the written form of the sound that Apollo had made when Hyacinthus died. This flower is the hyacinth. The plant still bears the prince's name, still blooms every spring in the colors of that ancient loss, still carries in its markings something that, if you know the story, you can read as a word of mourning. The spring festival at Sparta, the Hyacinthia, commemorated Hyacinthus every year. 3 days of celebration that began with mourning and ended with joy, in a ritual structure that embodied the understanding that grief and celebration are not opposites but neighbors, that the full honoring of loss includes the eventual return to life. Apollo could not save Hyacinthus. He could not reverse the death or punish Zephyrus adequately or undo the moment on the Eurotas riverbank. But he could do this. He could make the name last. He could ensure that the beauty and the loss were not simply absorbed by time and forgotten, but were preserved in a form that the natural world would continue to regenerate every spring, every year, for as long as springs came and flowers bloomed. He gave Hyacinthus the only immortality available to the loved ones of gods, the immortality of being permanently, tenderly remembered. The third story of this chapter is different in character from the first two, and I want to approach it carefully because it is a story in which Apollo is not the one who suffers most. And acknowledging that is part of telling it honestly. It is the story of Cassandra, the Trojan princess, and it is a story about the relationship between love and gifts, about what it means to give something precious and then to take it back, and about the particular cruelty that is possible when someone with great power feels that their generosity has been insufficiently appreciated. Cassandra was the daughter of Priam and Hecuba, king and queen of Troy, a mortal woman of remarkable beauty and, as it turned out, remarkable perception, an ability to see patterns and connections and likely outcomes that was, even before the divine element enters the story, something close to genuine prophetic intelligence. Apollo saw her and loved her, or wanted her, which is not always the same thing, though it can feel like it from the inside. And he offered her, as a gift and as an inducement, the one thing that a person of her particular gifts would most desire. He offered her the power of true prophecy. He breathed into her the ability to see the future clearly and completely, and without error. Cassandra accepted the gift, and then she refused Apollo. Why she refused him. After accepting his gift, the ancient sources offer various explanations. Some say she had intended to accept both gift and God, but changed her mind. Some say she had never intended anything except to receive the gift, and that the refusal was the plan from the beginning. Some say she simply looked at him, this god of beauty and clarity and terrible brightness, and felt something that was not love, and made the choice that Daphne had made, to be herself, undivided and complete, rather than to be what someone else's desire required. Apollo could not take back the prophecy. Divine gifts, once given, cannot be ungiven. This is one of the binding laws of the mythological universe, a constraint that applies even to Olympian gods. But he could do something else, something smaller and more precise, and in its way more devastating. He spat in her mouth. This detail, which appears in several ancient sources including Aeschylus, is horrible and is meant to be horrible. It is an act of petulant, punishing intimacy, a defilement of the very channel through which the gift had been given. And with that act, he added a second enchantment to the first. Cassandra would see the future perfectly and completely, and without error. And no one would believe her. She would see the fall of Troy coming from years away. She would see it in every detail. The wooden horse, the Greek soldiers hidden inside it, the opening of the gates, the fire, the deaths, the destruction of everything she had known and loved. She would tell people. She would tell them clearly and precisely, and with every detail necessary to prevent the catastrophe. She would be ignored, dismissed, considered mad, locked away by her own family who loved her and who could not bear what she was saying, and who could not help dismissing it as the ravings of a disturbed mind, because that is what Apollo's curse made every listener feel, that Cassandra's words, however compelling in the moment of hearing, were somehow unreliable, somehow not quite to be trusted, somehow just marginally not believable enough to act upon. She lived through the fall of Troy, seeing every moment of it before it happened. She survived the war only to be taken as a slave by Agamemnon, the Greek king, and to be killed eventually in Mycenae along with him, a death she also saw coming, clearly and completely, and could not prevent. Her story is one of the most purely tragic in all of Greek mythology, and it casts a long and complicated shadow over Apollo, who gave her the greatest of all his gifts and then made it a prison, who loved her in the way that sometimes love becomes, possessive, punitive, willing to wound in order to assert what it believes it is owed. The Greeks told this story without resolving it. They did not provide an explanation that made Apollo's behavior comprehensible or forgivable. They did not have Cassandra ultimately vindicated in a way that balanced the scales. They left it as it was, a story about power and refusal, about the difference between a gift that enriches the receiver and a gift that serves the giver's purposes, about the particular damage that is possible when love curdles into the desire for control. Apollo is not a villain in this story. He is something more complicated and more realistic, a figure of genuine greatness who does something genuinely terrible, who acts from a place of wounded pride in a way that marks his mythology honestly and permanently. And Cassandra remains across 3,000 years one of the most recognizable and most contemporary figures in all of ancient myth. Her name has entered the English language as a common noun. A Cassandra is someone who accurately predicts disaster and is not believed. Every age has its Cassandras, people who see what is coming clearly and completely and are dismissed for reasons of convenience or cognitive dissonance, or the simple human preference for comfortable uncertainty over uncomfortable truth. The myth anticipated this phenomenon with extraordinary precision. It gave it a name and a face and a story. This is what mythology does at its very best. It captures something so true about the human experience that it remains true across any distance of time or culture or circumstance, because the thing it has captured is not a historical curiosity, but a permanent feature of the landscape of being human. We have traveled far tonight through the territory of Apollo's heart, and the night has done what nights do. It has continued deepening while we were occupied with these stories, moving through its own unhurried geography toward the quiet country that lies on the other side of sleep. The 3 stories we have carried through this chapter, Daphne and the laurel, Hyacinthus and the hyacinth, Cassandra and the prophecy no one believed, are very different from each other in their emotional texture and their moral weight. But they are connected, all 3 of them, by a single thread that runs through everything we have been examining in these hours together. They are all stories about transformation, about what love does to the beloved and to the one who loves, about what endures when the love itself cannot. Daphne becomes a tree that will outlast any individual human lifetime. Hyacinthus becomes a flower that returns every spring. Cassandra becomes a word, a concept, a permanent category of human experience. None of these transformations is painless. None of them is entirely consoling, but all of them are forms of permanence, ways that the intensity of what was felt and what was lost refuses to simply disappear, insisting instead on being present in the world in whatever form is available to it. There is something in this, perhaps, that speaks to our own smaller loves and losses, the ones that are not mythological in scale, but that feel in the moments of their greatest intensity, as vast as anything the gods experienced. The people and moments and connections that, when they change or end, do not simply go away but find their way into the permanent fabric of who we are, becoming part of the way we see the light in the morning, or the sound a particular piece of music makes, or the quality of a spring afternoon when the hyacinths are blooming and the air is warm and the light is exactly right. The laurel tree is very quiet now. The hyacinths are folded in the dark, their petals cool, their markings invisible until morning returns to read them. Somewhere in the deep past of a ruined city, Cassandra sees everything that is coming and says so to the empty night. And the night, unlike the people of Troy, has no particular reason not to believe her. Sleep carries its own form of prophecy. It shows us things in the language of dream, not clearly, not with Apollo's crystalline precision, but in the older and more associative language that belongs to the hours before light returns. Let it come now. Let the stories settle into the deep places where stories go when we stop telling them, and they begin, quietly, to tell us. Asclepius was the son of Apollo and a mortal woman named Coronis, a princess of Thessaly, beautiful and beloved by the god in the manner that we have come to understand as characteristic of Apollo's loves. Intensely, vulnerably, with a completeness that left him exposed to loss in ways that his divine nature could not protect him from. Coronis became pregnant with Apollo's child, and this should have been a story of simple joy. It was not, because while she carried Apollo's child, she took a mortal lover, a man named Ischys, of considerably less divine magnificence than the father of her child, but present apparently in ways that mattered to her. A white crow, one of Apollo's sacred birds, in those early days of the world when crows were white rather than black, saw what was happening and carried the news to Apollo with the straightforward loyalty of a creature devoted to its god. Apollo's response to this news was immediate and catastrophic, and almost immediately regretted. He killed Coronis. The details of precisely how vary across ancient sources, but the fact is consistent. The god of clarity and truth, confronted with a truth he could not bear, acted from the most unclarified and untrue part of himself, the part that was rage and wounded pride and grief tangled together into something hot and irreversible. He killed her. And then, in the next moment, the ancient sources describe this with a kind of careful, unflinching honesty. He understood what he had done. He understood it completely and without any possibility of self-deception, because he was Apollo, the god of truth, and self-deception was the one luxury permanently unavailable to him. He turned the white crow black. This is why crows are black. It is the mark of the bird that brought bad news, and was punished not for lying, but for telling a truth that led to irreversible harm. The color of the crow became, in the Greek mythological imagination, a permanent record of this moment. The messenger punished, the message regretted, the harm done that cannot be undone. But Apollo did something else before Coronis's body was consumed by the funeral pyre. He reached into the fire, the god of light reaching into flame with something that was either courage or desperation, or both simultaneously. And he drew out the child who had not yet been born, who was still in the womb when his mother died, who had done nothing to deserve the fate that his father's rage and his mother's choices had placed him in. Apollo drew him out of the fire, living and whole, and carried him to the centaur Chiron on the wooded slopes of Mount Pelion. Chiron was the most extraordinary figure in the entire mythology of teaching and mentorship, a centaur half man and half horse, But unlike the wild and violent centaurs of popular imagination, he was ancient and wise and possessed of a learning that spanned medicine, music, prophecy, ethics, and the arts of war. He had tutored Achilles and Jason and many of the greatest heroes of the Greek world, and he received the infant Asclepius with the seriousness of a teacher who recognizes in a new student something exceptional, something that will exceed the teacher, something that the world is going to need. Asclepius grew up on Mount Pelion in the company of Chiron, learning everything the centaur had to teach. He learned the properties of plants, which roots and leaves and barks could reduce fever, ease pain, draw out infection, promote sleep, stimulate the body's own capacities for recovery. He learned the structure of the body, its bones and muscles, and the rivers of blood that ran through it, carrying life from the heart to the furthest extremities. He learned to observe, to look at a patient with the same precise, unhurried attention that his father gave to the world when he illuminated it each morning, seeing not only the obvious surface of things, but the patterns and relationships and underlying conditions that the obvious surface was expressing. He became, under Chiron's teaching, and with his father's divine gifts flowing through him, the greatest healer the world had yet seen. He became so great, in fact, that he eventually crossed the line that the Greek mythological universe had placed between what was permitted and what was not. He learned, through a combination of divine inheritance, extraordinary study, and a gift of serpent wisdom that the goddess Athena had given him, the blood from the right side of the Gorgon Medusa that could restore life. He learned how to raise the dead. Not metaphorically, not partially, not in the sense of recovering someone who had merely seemed dead. He learned to bring back people who had fully died, whose souls had crossed into the underworld, whose names were already recorded in the registers of the dead. He raised Hippolytus, son of Theseus. He raised Glaucus. He raised others. Each resurrection was a miracle, and each one pushed a little further against the boundary that Hades, the god of the underworld, regarded as absolute and inviolable. Hades complained to Zeus. The complaint was not unreasonable. If Asclepius could raise the dead indefinitely, the underworld would empty. The natural order of the world, in which living things lived and then died and made way for new living things, would be disrupted in a way that would eventually unmake everything. Death was not only a loss, death was also a function, the function that maintained the boundary between the mortal and the immortal, between the temporary and the permanent, between the world of the living and the world that came after. If that boundary became permeable in both directions, if the dead could be recalled as easily as the living could die, then the structure of existence itself was in danger. Zeus agreed with Hades, and Zeus responded in the way that Zeus responded to threats to the cosmic order. He struck Asclepius with a thunderbolt. The greatest healer who had ever lived died in the flash of a single divine thunderbolt, killed by the king of the gods for the crime of being too good at what he did, for pushing his gift past the point at which it served life and into the territory where it threatened the conditions that made life possible. Apollo's grief when Asclepius died was of a different quality from the grief he had felt for Hyacinthus. This was not the stunned, helpless grief of sudden accident, but something older and more complex threaded through with his own guilt because it was his son, his child, the child he had saved from the funeral pyre of the mother he had killed. He could not strike back at Zeus. Zeus was his father, the king of the gods, and the thunderbolt that had killed Asclepius was not wrong in the way that Zephyrus's wind had been wrong. It was terrible and it was devastating, and it was, from the perspective of the cosmic order, necessary. Apollo understood this. He was the god of truth and the god of proportion, and he understood, even in his grief, the necessity of what had been done. But he could not simply absorb the loss without response. He turned his silver bow against the Cyclopes, the divine craftsmen who had forged Zeus's thunderbolts, who were in this sense the instruments of his son's death, and he killed them. Zeus, in response, sentenced Apollo to a period of mortal servitude, to live as a man among men, to work as a laborer, to experience from the inside the mortal condition whose suffering his son had dedicated his life to alleviating. Apollo served this sentence tending the flocks of Admetus, king of Pherae in Thessaly, and the ancient sources record that this period, this time of enforced mortality, of ordinary labor, of life at the scale of the human rather than the divine, changed him, deepened him, added to the clarity of his divine perception a quality of compassion that only comes from having suffered in the specific, unprotected way that mortals suffer, without the insulation of divine power, without the consolation of immortality, without the ability to step back from pain into the perspective that makes it manageable. He came back from this servitude different from how he had gone into it. Still Apollo, still luminous, still precise, still the god of the silver bow and the golden lyre and the oracle at Delphi, but with something added that had not been there before, or had been there in potential and was now fully realized: the knowledge of what it felt like to be small, to be temporary, to face the day without certainty about the next day, to love someone knowing that you would lose them or they would lose you, and that this loss was not a failure of love, but its most honest expression. The god of healing, after his period of mortal servitude, understood healing from the inside in a way that pure divine knowledge could never have given him. He understood it as something done by the temporary for the temporary, by the vulnerable for the vulnerable, with the full knowledge of its limitations and the full commitment to it anyway. Asclepius, after his death, was placed among the stars as the constellation Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, depicted as a man holding a great serpent, because the serpent had become the symbol of his medical art. The serpent sheds its skin and emerges renewed, a natural image of healing, of recovery, of the body's own capacity for regeneration and return. The rod of Asclepius, a simple staff with a single serpent coiled around it, became and remains to this day the symbol of medicine throughout the Western world. You will see it on ambulances, on hospital signs, on the insignia of medical associations from Athens to Amsterdam to Auckland. 3,000 years after the myth was told, the symbol it generated is still the symbol that says, "Here is the place where people come to be healed." The temples of Asclepius, the Asclepia, of which hundreds existed throughout the ancient Greek world, were the ancient world's hospitals and medical schools simultaneously. Patients came from great distances to sleep in the temple precincts to undergo the ritual of incubation, lying down in the sacred space of the god, open to whatever healing the night might bring. Dreams were the primary diagnostic and therapeutic tool. The dreamer would receive in sleep a vision of the god or his sacred serpents, and from the content and imagery of the dream, the priests of Asclepius would prescribe treatment. The treatments themselves were a mixture of what we would now recognize as genuinely effective medicine: herbal remedies, dietary changes, exercise, rest, bathing in sacred springs, and religious ritual, prayer, sacrifice, the psychological and spiritual support of being held within a sacred framework that regarded recovery as not just possible, but divinely sanctioned. The most famous of all the Asclepia was at Epidaurus in the northeastern Peloponnese, and it was one of the most visited places in the ancient world. Patients came from across the Mediterranean, from every social class, carrying their illnesses and their hopes through the pine forests of the sanctuary to the great Delos, the circular building whose exact purpose scholars still debate, which may have housed the sacred serpents of the god, and to the temple where they would sleep and wait and dream. The votive offerings left at Epidaurus in gratitude for cures form one of the most touching archives of human vulnerability in all of antiquity. Small marble or terracotta models of healed body parts, an eye that could see again, a leg that could walk again, an ear that could hear, a hand that could hold, each one representing an individual person's encounter with illness and recovery, an individual life that had been, however briefly, restored. What these offerings tell us is something that the myth itself also tells us, if we listen to it carefully, that healing is not the same as curing, and that the presence of a healer is not the same as the guarantee of a cure. Not everyone who came to Epidaurus went home recovered. Not everyone who called on Asclepius received what they had come for. The god was powerful, but not omnipotent. His death at Zeus's thunderbolt had established that permanently, had drawn the line between what medicine could do and what it could not do with a clarity that was terrible and honest, and ultimately, in the long run of history, enormously important. Medicine that knows its limits is medicine that can be trusted. Medicine that claims to do everything is medicine that has confused itself with magic. And the difference between medicine and magic is the difference between the measured, humble, continuously improving project of understanding the body's actual mechanisms and the empty promise of a power that operates outside of those mechanisms entirely. Apollo taught this. Asclepius embodied it. The entire subsequent history of Western medicine, from Hippocrates, who made the explicit connection between Asclepius and his own empirical, observation-based approach to healing, to the physicians of the medieval Islamic world who preserved and expanded the Greek medical tradition, to the researchers and clinicians of the present day working at the precise, humble, endlessly patient frontier of what can be understood and treated, all of it flows from this mythological source. Not in the sense that the myth caused medicine to develop. Medicine developed because human beings were sick and needed help and were clever enough over many generations to figure out how to give it. But in the sense that the myth gave medicine its self-understanding, its sense of its own nature and purpose and appropriate limits. The myth said, "Here is what you are. You are the gift of Apollo working through the hands of Asclepius, working through the hands of every physician who has come after. You are light applied to the body. You are clarity in the service of life. You are the long, patient, imperfect, absolutely essential work of trying to see truly and act well in the face of what you see. You will not always succeed. The limits are real, and they are non-negotiable. But within those limits, the work is sacred. Within those limits, the work matters more than almost anything else that human beings do." The night has reached that peculiar country that lies between 3 and 4 in the morning, the hours that feel furthest from both the previous evening and the coming day, the hours that belong entirely to themselves, that have no social identity or cultural meaning, that are simply the deep middle of the dark. If you are still awake at this hour, you are awake in the way that the mythological world is awake, not for any particular practical purpose, but in a state of openness, of receptivity, of having released the day's agenda without yet having picked up the morning's. You are in the condition that the ancient Greeks called the threshold state, the condition of someone who is between one thing and another, who is neither here nor there, but in the passage between them. It is the condition in which dreams are most vivid and most honest. It is the condition in which the old stories reach us most directly, bypassing the rational apparatus that the daylight hours keep so productively engaged, and arriving instead in the deeper places where they have always been meant to live. We have spent this long night with Apollo, the god of light and music and prophecy and healing, the god who was born on a floating island and grew up into something the world had been waiting for without knowing it. We have watched him take his place at the center of the Greek divine world, his light organizing the landscape around him the way that the sun organizes the solar system, not by force but by the simple gravitational fact of its presence, its warmth, its illumination of everything within its reach. We have heard his music, received his prophecies, witnessed his loves and losses, and arrived finally at his role as the source and patron of the long human project of healing. What does it mean to have spent a night with this particular god? What does Apollo leave behind when the story is done? And the book, metaphorically or literally, is closed. Perhaps this, the understanding that clarity is not the same as coldness, that precision is not the same as distance, that the God who sees everything most clearly is also, in the Greek telling of him, the God who feels everything most acutely, who loves with his whole being, who grieves without reserve, who carries his losses forward as sacred obligations rather than burying them under the smooth surface of divine dignity. Apollo is not a god who stands apart from the human experience and illuminates it from a safe and comfortable distance. He is a god who enters into the human experience, who suffers it, who is changed by it, who emerges from his period of mortal servitude with a depth of compassion that his pure divine nature could not have given him. He is the light that does not merely shine on things from outside but passes through them, as sunlight passes through clear water or through the thin membrane of a leaf, illuminating from within. Perhaps also this, that the gifts worth having are not the ones that remove difficulty, but the ones that make us more capable of meeting it. The gift of prophecy does not prevent the prophesied disaster. It gives us, at most, the knowledge with which to face it consciously rather than blindly. The gift of music does not dissolve grief. It gives grief a form in which it can be held and shared, and therefore survived. The gift of healing does not defeat death. It holds death at a respectful and negotiated distance, reclaiming from it what can be reclaimed, accepting what cannot be reclaimed, with the honest acknowledgement that acceptance is also a form of wisdom. And perhaps most quietly and most usefully, this, that light returns. This is the oldest and most fundamental of all Apollo's promises, the one that the ancient Greeks felt most deeply in their bones and their seasonal rituals and their daily lives. The light goes away. It goes away every evening, and in the winter it withdraws for such long stretches that the world becomes a colder and more contracted place, and there are nights when the dark feels absolute and the morning feels genuinely uncertain. But the light returns. Apollo drives his chariot back across the horizon every morning without fail, without exception, without regard for whether the night has been easy or difficult, whether the world deserves the illumination or not. The light does not require merit. It does not require preparation. It simply comes in its own time, as it has always come, as it will always come, for as long as the world turns and the sun holds its place at the center, and the long, faithful cycle of dark and light continues its ancient, patient, unbroken rhythm. You are very close to sleep now. Perhaps you are already there, and these words are arriving in that soft, permeable region where language begins to lose its edges, and the stories we tell ourselves start to blend with the stories we are told by whatever wiser and less verbal part of us takes over when the daylight self finally, gratefully, sets down its burdens and rests. This is the best place to receive the old stories, not in the alertness of full wakefulness, where we are most inclined to analyze and judge and hold things at arm's length, but in this softer country, where we can let them in without precondition, without defense, without requiring them to be anything other than what they are: old, true, human, and still, after all this time, exactly what we needed to hear. Apollo's chariot is somewhere below the horizon right now, moving through the underground passage that connects the evening's end to the morning's beginning. He is on his way. He is always on his way. The light is always, even in the deepest dark, already in the process of returning. Sleep now. The god of healing is keeping watch. The god of music is playing something very quiet, very far away, just below the threshold of hearing. The god of prophecy knows how this night ends, in sleep, in rest, in the gradual return of the light to a world that is always, despite everything, worth illuminating. Sleep. The morning will be exactly what it needs to be. The light will come when it comes. And Apollo, patient, luminous, bearing in his golden arms the accumulated grief and wonder and stubborn loving persistence of 3,000